Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Ask the Grant Writing Experts. I'm Dr. Meg Bouvier. You know me as the creator of your library of NIH grantsmanship courses. I have over 35 years of experience at NIH as an applicant, intramural researcher, staff writer, and now as a full-time NIH grant mentor. I've helped clients land over $500 million in federal funding, and I'm here to answer your NIH grant writing questions. So grab a cup of coffee and let's get started. So a reminder, if you're attending live, you're in listen-only mode. So there is a Q&A box on the panel of your Zoom screen. You can type questions in there anytime you like. There's also a chat box, and you'll be seeing information that our team will be putting there for you. So feel free to type any questions or comments that you want to make, and we'll be answering them throughout the session. If you're watching this as a recording, just a disclaimer that it is August 9th, 2023, and everything we say today is true to the best of our knowledge as of today, but things change quickly at NIH and in other agencies, so you should always check the information at other agencies to make sure it is up to date. So in terms of what you should be viewing right now, it is mid-August. So I would think that if you're targeting the cycle 3 deadlines at NIH, which is October, November, you would probably be well into watching Master the R Series Parts 1 and Part 2, which deal with the prep steps and writing of the specific games, and that you've reached out to the program officer and you're vetting the idea and just beginning the writing and watching Part 3, Significance and Innovation. In terms of news at NIH, I just want to remind people that NIH has now ended their COVID era policy of allowing preliminary data as post-submission material across all mechanisms. That's the bad news. The good news is that they've made it a permanent policy for R01, R21, and R03 applications that allow post-submission material. So you can now upload as post-submission material preliminary data, not just updates to your publications, but preliminary data itself. And that information can be uploaded up after the deadline and up until 30 days before your study section meets. So it buys you a couple of more months of time. So I am delighted today to welcome back Emilie Clemmens. We had so many questions for her last time that I thought it would be wonderful to have her back again. As you recall, Dr. Clemmens is a former SRO from the CDMRP, and she will be answering questions today, mine and yours. So feel free, she'll do an introduction now, and feel free to type your questions in the Q&A box. So Emilie, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thanks for having me back, Meg. As Meg said, I am a former scientific review officer for CDMRP, and I'm also currently adjunct professor at the University of Kentucky, and now, of course, founder and owner of Artemis Editing. So I leveraged the experience that I had managing peer review for CDMRP now to help people write top-notch applications for CDMRP and for other organizations as well. So, and I'm excited to answer your questions about CDMRP or any other questions that you have.
And just a quick question, are you at University of Kentucky, the university or the medical center?
The university. I'm in the Department of Biomedical Engineering, so we have a lot of crossover with the Med Center, but at the university. Yeah.
I have a dear client who just accepted a department chair position there. That's why I asked. So,
congrats!
Just working with the medical center, yeah. So, so anyway, I made a list of questions that I had from your last session that I didn't get a chance to ask. So. And just to remind people, one of the things that we learned last time is, or among the things that we learned last time is that, because I'm always thinking of how my applicants can use different funding agencies in addition to NIH. And so it's interesting to me how they're similar and how they're different. And what I heard you say last time was that CDMRP is often interested in funding things that are more high risk than NIH, that NIH is they're often criticized for funding next logical steps research. They do have mechanisms that are high risk, high reward. There are 4 of those out of the Office of the Director. So if anybody wants more information about those, let me know. But it's like the DP2, the DP5, those that are out of the Office of the Director. But by and large, the overwhelming majority of the NIH budget is funded for very conservative projects that are largely done in next logical steps research. So can you tell us a little bit more about that risk element in CDMRP?
Certainly. And yeah, it's funny that you use the word criticize too, because I mean, that work is so important. The incremental work, of course, is critical. And it's nice that we have another option, though, that, the CDMRP was really founded on the premise that we needed something that could take more risk to potentially get to patients faster. And it's really inherent in the history of the program. And it was started by patient advocates who lobbied Congress for funding specific for, fast track, potentially high risk, maybe untested ideas. And this was, to my knowledge, really predates the idea of sort of the X Prize or the moonshot type of approaches, which have since become also part of the funding landscape. So this was back in 1992 when it all started. And yeah, so CDMRP really has that goal, that focus, and that is also part of its review process. There are a number of different types of funding opportunities under the CDMRP umbrella, different scopes, different breadths, different purposes, but all of it is really couched in the understanding that they're looking for some high risk, high reward, and also areas of research that traditionally don't have a lot of funding and need a little more focus.
Yeah, and I think there are, for people who are, were trained to believe that they need to build their entire independent research lab on R01 funding, I think that can be, nowadays, that can be a mistake, because I think it's harder to land an R01 than it has been historically. And so it's really nice to know what other options are out there. And I do think there are also a lot of private foundations who specifically look to fund the types of work that are not being funded at NIH. They're looking for areas to plug up the holes, so to speak. So, and I agree with you, like there is a place for funding next logical steps research, of course. And, when I was a staff writer at NHGRI, I participated in a lot of appropriations defenses, essentially is what they are. You're defending your budget request for the upcoming year to appropriation subcommittees. And appropriation subcommittees are pretty harsh. They're pretty, like they are stewards of taxpayer dollar, and NIH has to account for where they're putting that, tens of billions of dollars. It's a huge, huge budget at NIH. I think it's closing in on 50 billion at this point. It's much larger. It's like 4 times the size of, no more than that, much more than that, than NSF, for example. So yeah, so they get criticized if they can't show something for it. And when you gamble, you usually lose, but there is a place for gambling. So there definitely is a place.
Absolutely.
So a few other questions I had. So one of them was, I wanted to hear more about, one of the things that I suggest to NIH applicants when they're writing their grant application, most of the R-level applications are reviewed at the Center for Scientific Review, which was developed during the course of my career in biomedical research back in the olden days, and there'll be probably people on this call who remember this. Everything was reviewed at the institutes, and then CSR was formed as a separate entity from NIH, ostensibly to make review more independent of NIH itself. So now the only things that are reviewed in institutes tend to be like the pre and postdoctoral F series, the mentored, some of the mentored Ks, not all of them, and things like T32 training grants and center grants and some of the RFAs are reviewed at the institutes, but most everything else, including most of the R series, is at CSR. And for the most part, you can see those rosters. And so one of the things that I advise people is that you absolutely should go in and look at the roster for the panel that you're going to request, the panel of reviewers you're going to request, so that you know who's on it and you can pitch the writing accordingly. You can, you know how much prior knowledge to assume among the writers. And you can cite people appropriately, because goodness knows if there's somebody on that panel who has expertise in your area, you have not cited them. Oh my God, are you going to be
could be a problem? Yeah.
Every single time I've seen summary statements that say you didn't cite the seminal work,
my work,
blah blah blah, and it's always, you know, like what is that project they're talking? I can't find this like tool, this questionnaire. It's like something that's been published in some obscure journal that nobody uses, but the person is on the panel. You know? Yeah. So you have to really go look at that. So tell me a little bit about the availability of that information to an applicant to CDMRP.
Right. It's really quite different. At least I don't think it's changed since I left in 2021. So yeah, I mean, for the NIH, of course, it's about knowing your audience. Is it, you know, for anything that you ever write, you want to know your audience. Trickier with CDMRP because there are two. There's a dual panel review. The applications go through the peer review and the programmatic review. The peer review is not open. You cannot, as an applicant, look and see who is on the peer review panel. So that's very different. The programmatic panel, however, is available for public viewing, so you can see who is on that. And programmatic review it takes place, of course, after peer review. So you can, in a sense, know a little bit about your audience in the sense of, you know, after peer review happens, and again, this gets at the CDMRP two-tier process, where there is no pay line for CDMRP. So what happens is peer reviewers, they do score the applications, and the highest scoring applications move on to programmatic review. But then the programmatic review panel gets to sort of choose what they think best fits the programmatic needs from that batch. So you could have a high score and potentially not get funded. So a long answer to your question is, it's possible to know who is in the programmatic panel. And so you can kind of keep in mind what they might be thinking is of a higher priority. But in terms of peer review, you have no idea who is on that panel.
Okay, and how big are those, that first level of review, the scientific, how large is that panel?
They can be anywhere from 5 to 20 individuals. And what happens is how the difference there is really the number of applications that are received, and then the size of the batch of applications that are assigned to a given panel. So each application is reviewed by 2 scientist reviewers and 1 consumer reviewer, which I will probably talk about that as well. And then any additional sort of specialist reviewers that are, and that depends on what type of funding mechanism it is. And so those numbers, of course, are just if a panel is given 20 applications, then you calculate how many reviewers you need to not give the panelists too many applications to review.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, NIH also has that 2 level where it's scientific review and programmatic review. And I think most people don't know about the second one, but it does exist. And their panels are usually at CSR, I would say maybe 20 to 30 people, but no patient advocate. So please talk a little bit more about that, because I'm just fascinated by this patient advocate representation. Is it also on the programmatic panel that there are patient advocates? Or just
yes, I believe.
Okay.
I'm going to double check that while we are answering questions so that I'm not lying to you, but I believe so.
So while you look that up, I'll talk about also how, so NIH has this first level of review that's scientific at CSR, and they also kind of do the same thing, but among a larger panel where you're assigned reviewers, and but then the whole group discusses the top half and votes. And you're not just scored, but you're ranked against your cohort, which is why sometimes applicants get overall scores that are bewildering to them based on what the reviewer's comments are. It's because you're ranked against your cohort. You're not just receiving a score. Then you move on to the programmatic review, which sounds somewhat similar to this. It's actually an advisory panel to the institute director. And that does actually have one usually representative from the community on it. But it's not necessarily a patient advocate. It's a community member, which is what, like, it could be anything. I've seen all kinds of people called a community member. But then other than that, they might have legislative people, policy experts, researchers, all kinds of people serve on those panels. And it's not quite as open-ended as you're describing for CDMRP, where it's like, well, we have this batch of well-scoring applications, and let's just examine them and see which ones really intrigue us and think would be the best fit programmatically for us. NIH tends to award the absolute top scoring applications, and as they get closer to their pay line, they'll hand select because they cluster so tightly around the pay line. They tend to cluster very tightly around the pay line, and they'll pick and choose in there, which is kind of a little known fact. I think at NIH, it's a misconception that the score is the score and you're awarded or not based on the score, and there's absolutely no selection process on the part of the POs or the programmatic panel, and that is absolutely not correct, because I went to those.
That's surprising, because that's the misconception I certainly have heard and continue to hear in academia.
It's a misconception in two ways. So one is that I, having attended those for years, the closed sessions of those for years as a staff writer, I have seen program officers absolutely go to the mats for an applicant they believe in. And if the person might not have scored all that well, like, you know, like it's not like they can do this for somebody who scored in the 50th percentile, but you know, if you scored like in the 20th percentile and you're like pretty outside of the funding range, I've seen them just go to the mats for somebody they believe in, which is why it's so important to build a relationship with the program officer. And the other thing is that program officers have a mechanism at their discretion, which you can't apply for as an outsider. It's called the R56 mechanism. So you're not allowed as an applicant to apply for it, and almost no one knows about this mechanism. But if a program officer has access to some slush fund money, and most institutes have a little bit of this somewhere in their budget, and they really like this application and they want you to resubmit in a year or two with a stronger R1, they can give you a little bit of funding under the what's called the R56 mechanism, and you can come back and you know, a year or two later with a stronger R1. So they exercise a lot of control, these program officers, and I think
that's interesting.
Yeah, NIH applicants, I think, don't recognize that. So, so you were looking something up just now.
Yes, as far as I can tell, I confirmed it by looking at several different programs that, excuse me, the programmatic panels do have patient advocacy representatives on them as well. So maybe we should talk about that a bit. Excuse me, in terms of the peer review process. So all of the peer review panels have patient advocates, military focused applications or batches of applications may have military representatives. Although not all research proposals specifically relate to military applications and CDMRPs, important to note. And these individuals score the applications the same as the scientific reviewers and specialist reviewers. So they give it an overall score. In terms of their review process, they certainly do not review the scientific merit of an application. What they're looking at is naturally what they feel is the potential patient impact or military impact of the proposed work. So they're really providing a perspective that says, you know, I don't know if the science is sound here, but what I can tell you is if this works, this will be, you know, immediately impactful for a large percentage of our patient population. Or conversely, they might say, even if this works, this is really not going to make a big difference to the quality of life for patients. And so from my perspective, in the years that I spent watching this happen, I noticed a trend where you would have, because all of the panels, still saying all of the panels that are put together are de novo. So you're bringing in new people, they're not standing panels. So you're bringing in scientist reviewers who may or may not have reviewed for CDMRP in the past. They will find out about the patient advocacy. They will initially express concerns and say, wait a minute, how can they get this, score the same without understanding the nuances of the science? By the end of the review process, almost all of them are convinced of the value of having this patient advocate perspective. Really help them understand where the field is at from that unique perspective and where the gaps are, and whether or not something would be impactful. I also saw the patient advocates be very respectful of the scientists' positions and their opinions on the scientific merit to help them understand what they should score. So it was a really collaborative process, and one that I think everyone sort of walked away from feeling pretty positively about. And so I found it to be a positive aspect. It does, of course, now you are knowing that, and we just spoke about writing for your audience. You don't know who the scientists or the patient advocates will be, but you will know that there are patient advocates on the panel. And so with that in mind, I counsel applicants to structure their certain areas of the narrative to really emphasize and help a lay reader understand how this is going to be impactful for patients, or what the timeline is looking like to clinic, for example.
So we do have a question. How does that kind of community member review affect basic science grant applications which don't have direct patient impact? It's a great question.
Well, that's a great question. CDMRP does not do a lot of basic science research funding. So almost everything that they're looking at is looking for applied research funding. So I think that's the short answer. However, there's always sort of there's gray area in, okay, well, are we basic or are we close to applied, or where CDMRP also has small grants for what they call idea development. So you have no preliminary data. And in fact, preliminary data on idea development grants isn't even permitted. So so they're smaller, usually about 200,000. And so it's even pre-basic research, really. So, but in those cases, the impetus is still on the applicant to be able to make the case, to be able to lay out that story, lay out that plan and that timeline to how they believe this idea may have an impact in the near or far term. So, they look at both short and long-term impact.
Great. And there's one other question I wanted to ask you about the time to notice of award. And then I do have one question that somebody had emailed me, so we'll finish up with that. So NIH has a very long time to notice of award. So it can be like 9 months to notice of award. It's like having a baby and about as painful. So, so talk a little bit about this reduced timeline, because this is very interesting to me in terms of helping my clients strategize about how to build a comprehensive funding portfolio, which includes things outside of NIH.
Absolutely. So with one caveat, I will say that there certainly are there are instances in which it can take just as long as NIH. But again, the many different types of, like NIH, many different types of funding mechanisms underneath a CDMRP umbrella. They're completely dependent on the different programs that are also under the CDMRP umbrella. The shorter, the smaller applications, such as the idea development grants that I just mentioned, the turnaround time on those can be in a few months. So they can be very rapid. Whereas you will have, they have some consortium grants that, of course, take a lot longer to review because you're bringing in like 5 elements from 5 different organizations. So those typically take a longer time to make a decision. So those in the clinical trials can take 9 months, similar to the NIH timeline. But these sort of R01 similar grants, which are the IIRAs, or Independent Investigator Research Awards, are typically reviewed in about 6 months. So that's a little bit faster timeline.
And I want to remind people that you can submit to multiple federal agencies in parallel. So you can't have the same science and review at 2 different places at NIH at the same time, but you can have the exact same science and review at multiple federal agencies and foundations at the same time. And if you are junior faculty coming up on your ESI expiration or your tenure review, that kind of a shotgun approach may make sense for you. So that's something to discuss with your mentors. But this is part of why we're talking about this. It's like not putting all your eggs in one basket and not assuming that the only path to an independent research lab is R01 funding. There are many, many ways to get there and many ways to plug the holes in your funding as well. So,
yes, and speaking of plug, I'll even make a plug there, because one of the things that I try to do is exactly that, is to take someone's NIH application and then really help to, even if it's the same science, to craft it for the CDMRP audience.
Yeah.
So, there's a few different hurdles, a few different tweaks that need to be made to make it appropriate for the CDMRP. And of course, you can't get funded for the same research by the different agencies, but that all works out in the wash with the grants management process.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, and that's a great point. So for anyone who is accustomed to applying to NIH and is interested in applying to CDMRP and has identified something, a funding opportunity that might be of interest, Emilie has a company that helps with that. So her contact information is in the chat for anybody who would like to take a look at that. So. Oh, and there's a blog post I forgot. There's the first part of probably a 2-part blog post is in the chat as well. So I am going to just quickly answer this one question that I got via email from a member. I was wondering if you could answer a question on the difference between a data sharing plan and a resource sharing plan. I get this question a lot. This is specifically for a P50, which is a center grant. It's a Center of Excellence P50. My team put together the data management and sharing plan, although we're unsure we need to do the resource sharing plan, as resource sharing plans have their own section on SF 2424. Basically, it goes on and on. Like there are so many places, then they keep changing the places. So here's the long and the short of it is, first and foremost, always read your NOFO. Your notice of funding opportunity is that supersedes everything. It supersedes SF 424 and everything else. And I think that's probably true at all federal agencies, right? Yeah. Definitely. So always read every word of that to make sure you understand it. So a resource sharing plan, which goes in attachment 10, is required only when the PI plans to generate the following, either sharing of model organisms and research tools. So we're probably going to be writing this up in a blog post, but those are the 2 types of things that you need to be aware of. If you're not doing either of those things, then don't worry about it. So if you don't have either of those things and your NOFO doesn't ask for a resource sharing plan, then you don't have to include one. The genomic data sharing plan should be part of the DMSP, which goes in the other plan section. And we've talked quite a bit about the new DMSP for NIH that came into effect about 9 months ago. So in the other plan section, which is attachment 11, the applicants subject to the NIH data management sharing policy include their data management sharing plan in this attachment. And if the applicants are also subject to the NIH genomic data sharing policy, they must attach a single plan including elements for both policies. So that's a lot of information, and it's changed within the last year, and I can guarantee you it's going to change again in the upcoming year, because that's NIH. They just sit around like they're dreaming up these things to irk their applicants. That's not really what they do. It feels that way sometimes. So,
I can't say it's better for CDMRP in that regard either. Things are always in flux. And so I'm glad you had the disclaimer because I think based on what I know.
today, right? Based on
Today.
what we
Yeah.
know today on August
Yeah.
9th, 2023. Yeah. So anyway, it's always a delight, Emilie, to have you on. I'm just endlessly curious about, anything that people know about the funding landscape. And again, anybody who's interested in working with Emilie, her contact information is in the chat. It's also there's at least one blog post up that we co-authored, and we're in the process of co-authoring another one. So, and our information is there. Or if you didn't catch her information, feel free to contact us at info@bouviergrant.com. So, Emilie, always a delight, and we hope to see you in the next cycle. I think our next one, let's see, today is the 9th. So in 2 weeks, we will have David Widmer back on. Recall that David Widmer was a research development expert at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, which is a top 5, long-standing top 5 cancer center in the country. And he will be talking with us about early communication with grants or compliance offices for seamless submission. So that's going to be our topic for the next one. And Emilie, we hope to see you in the next batch of AGE topics for cycle 1 applicants. So thank you so much for coming again.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.
Take care. Have a great day, everybody. Bye-bye.